I first heard about near-death experience decades ago when I was in my residency training for my medical specialty, radiation oncology. It's the use of radiation to treat cancer. That was back in an era before internet when they had these big old thick medical journal volumes. And I was sitting here flipping through the pages of a very prominent medical journal looking for my cancer related article, and completely by accident found an article with the term near death experience in it. Well, I've never heard of that before. And everything I'd learned medically is you're either dead or you're not dead. And what's this near death experience? So fascinated, I read the article and I was amazed. Here was a cardiologist, a heart doctor, who had a study where patients that coded, their heart stopped, were having near death experiences and were able to observe what was going on around them with remarkable detail and accuracy. So intrigued, I read some of the bibliography and some of the other articles and got to thinking somewhat prophetically, why aren't more people doing research on this fascinating phenomena? Well, several years later, I had a college friend visiting me, and his wife shared a dramatic near-death experience. And so I was hooked. I decided I needed to know, are near-death experiences real or not real at that time? I was, if you will, starting out as a skeptic. I'm going to show it to me kind of guy that guides my medical recommendations throughout my whole life. So upon having some time, I was able to set up what's called the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. It's a website at nderf.org, a nonprofit website devoted to people sharing their near-death experiences, completing a questionnaire, and helping me, and in turn, the information I got from that, sharing with the world to better understand near-death experiences. And even after I had within a couple dozen near-death experiences shared off that website, I realized very quickly near-death experiences are, in a word, real.
Excellent. And so you have a scientific mind and a scientific approach. Why don't you begin by kind of highlighting what for you were the most compelling, convincing pieces of evidence which compelled you further to investigate this as a scientist?
Sure. As I started researching near-death experiences, I always remembered that basic scientific principle, and that is what's real is consistently observed. And I was fascinated as the near-death experiences started pouring in. By dozens became hundreds, and there was that remarkable consistency in what occurs during near-death experiences. The deeper elements, what occurs, if you will, the characteristics, what happens, typically observed in very frequently in near-death experiences, and typically in very consistent order too. So I realized that this was near-death experiences in what they shared, bespeaking their evidentiality.
Okay. Now, one thing you note, and it's been noted elsewhere, is that there are, I believe, 12
Mhm.
consistent features of a near-death experience. In order for an experience to be considered an NDE, you need these dozen elements of it. So, could you tell us a little bit about that and how those conclusions were ever reached?
Sure. Now, while no two near-death experiences are the same, if you study a lot of it, and I've studied over 4,000, you see those very consistent features or characteristics of the near-death experience. A typical, very detailed near-death experience, for example, would be, boom, you have that life-threatening event. They're unconscious or clinically dead. They shouldn't have any memory by the very dictionary definition. They're unconscious. They're not supposed to have any memory at that time, but they do. That's the experience part of a near-death experience. And again, a typical detailed near-death experience would involve initially what's called an out-of-body experience. Their consciousness arises from their unconscious physical body, typically over their physical body, and from that vantage point, they can see and hear ongoing earthly events, including others frantically trying to bring them back to life often. They then may pass into or through a tunnel. At the end of the tunnel, there's often a beautiful, mystical, unearthly light, variably described. One person said it was like a million times a million suns, but never hurts their eyes. It's not uncomfortable. At the end of that tunnel, they're into an unearthly realm. It's been called a heavenly realm. And that's probably a reasonable terminology because in this realm, it's certainly unearthly in many, many ways. There may be buildings, landscapes. There have been descriptions of colors so beautiful they don't exist on Earth. There's no correlates. Music may be beyond anything that's earthly possible in terms of being so beautiful. In this unearthly realm, they may encounter deceased loved ones. These are joyous reunions, and even deceased pets are often encountered and described in near death experiences. They may encounter what they call a life review. They may see a part or even all of their entire prior life, which is an excellent example of the great acceleration of consciousness so often described in near death experiences. Typically, what they're feeling at this time is overwhelmingly positive emotions. Peace and love are two of the most common descriptive words that people use to describe their near death experiences. They may interact with other beings. At the end of the near death experience, there may be a dialogue with another being with them about a decision, whether to return to their earthly life or to stay in this beautiful unearthly realm. Interestingly, even though near death experiencers' entire life, years, decades of all their prior memory was their earthly life, friends, family, loved ones, at that moment of decision that so many people that have near death experiences face, the great majority do not want to leave that unearthly heavenly realm. They feel a powerful sense that that's their real home. They don't want to leave. They feel overwhelming positive emotions, connection. They really want to stay there. However, if they're either sent back to their earthly life involuntarily, or if a decision is made for them to return to their earthly body, boom, as soon as they recover from that close brush with death, they've got their near death experience to share.
Excellent.
Mhm.
And so, one of the most powerful items of evidence, or one of the most powerful features in a near-death experience, is it's the instances when the experiencers are able to see and hear things which later prove to actually be accurate. And so, whether you're a scientist or even a police detective, that would be a compelling piece of evidence. Why don't you talk about that?
There's no question that there's no question that what they see and hear in that initial characteristic of near death experience called the out of body experience is highly evidential. Multiple studies, including my own, find, at least in my study, 97% of the time, what they see in that out of body experience of ongoing earthly events, even while they're physically unconscious or clinically dead with no heartbeat, is accurate down to the finest details. They can describe later in vivid detail how the emergency medical team arrived, how many times they were shocked, what people were saying, what they were doing, who was coming and going, in stunning detail from the perspective of consciousness above their body. And in fact, these out of body observations may be far geographically from their physical body, far outside of any possible physical sensory awareness. And yet again, remarkably consistent, whether it's many, many yards, even miles away from their physical body. If they observe ongoing earthly events, they're essentially always accurate down to the finest detail with no error whatsoever in their observations. Possible explanations of near death experience are literally hypotheses until you correlate what your guess or hypothesis is about the cause of near death experiences with what you observe. There's absolutely no medical explanation possible, electrical chemistry, electricity of any type that can possibly explain those vividly accurate out of body observations. And in fact, we have scores of people that had near death experiences while they were under adequate general anesthesia. So they were under anesthesia, they were absolutely shut down to the brainstem level. That's why you typically have to artificially ventilate people when they're under full anesthesia, and yet their heart stopped. So it should be, if you will, doubly impossible for them to have any memory at that time. And yet, by the scores, people share typical near death experiences under such circumstances. That line of evidence single handedly excludes any possibility that near death experiences are explainable by physical brain function.
Very good, very good. And of course, another observation or claim of skeptics is that people essentially, quote, see and experience what they want. And that, for instance, would be why for instance, a devout Christian would say that he encountered Christ, a Hindu encounters Shiva, but in terms of your kind of cross-cultural investigation, what are your thoughts about the kind of rock solid, consistent, or nearly universal things at both the deepest level and more superficial level of the near-death experience, which speaks against the idea that we just experience whatever we want?
Sure. For example, I've studied near-death experiences in very young children under the age of 5, average age of the study group, 3.5 years old. Now, at that age, they're practically culturally a blank slate. They typically don't have, in fact, generally don't have any pre-existing religious beliefs. They don't understand death. They certainly, almost certainly, have never heard of near-death experience or have no idea what it means. And yet, even in this very young group, the characteristics, what occurs during their near-death experience, is strikingly similar to older children and adults. So again, one more line of evidence that near-death experiences aren't culturally determined. It's not what you believe. There seems to be something independent, and that's corroborated by my cross-cultural study. We have portions of our study website translated into over 30 different languages. So all around the world, we have people sharing their near-death experiences, again, strikingly similar. In fact, we have scores and scores of near-death experiences from non-Western countries. And once again, what occurs during the near-death experience, those characteristics, strikingly similar wherever on the world they occur, whatever the religious belief or cultural belief of that area of the world is. And it's amazing that it seems to make no difference whether you're, say, a Muslim in Egypt or a Hindu in India or a Christian in the United States, anywhere on the planet that you have a near-death experience, what occurs is going to be strikingly similar. There's absolutely no evidence that there's a significant change in what occurs during the near-death experience based on pre-existing beliefs. We've had atheists encounter God. We've had atheists encounter religious figures that they didn't believe was ever possible. So there doesn't seem to be any real evidence to support the skeptics' hypothesis, actually, that near-death experiences are significantly, substantially culturally determined.
Excellent. So maybe we could take a moment and delve into any one specific case, like a specific NDE, if there's one that kind of stands out in your mind as being especially compelling.
Sure. Many years ago, I interviewed Vicky. Vicky was interesting in the sense that she was born totally blind. So from birth, she was unable to have any perception of light, complete blindness. To her, vision was unknown and unknowable. You cannot explain vision to someone born totally blind in terms of the remaining 4 physical senses. I tried, it's impossible. Vicky, in her early 20s, was involved in a bad car wreck. She was being driven home from a place where she was a professional singer. The first time Vicky saw her body was in what we've talked about, that out-of-body experience. Her consciousness was above her body, and down below her, she had vision. She saw a body. She was horrified because vision was so unfamiliar. And after she calmed down, she was able to correlate the feel of her long hair and, interestingly, a ring that her father had given her, only known throughout her entire life by the sense of touch. Now she realized by vision that that was really her in the gurney down below. Vicky went on to have a very detailed near-death experience, many of the characteristics we previously discussed. Interestingly, Vicky had the visual awareness that so many other near-death experiencers describe, and that's so-called 360-degree vision. In other words, they're simultaneously aware and can visually process visual sight, if you will, information in front of them, behind them, up, down, right, left. Technically, the term should be spherical vision, all going on simultaneously. In fact, when I told Vicky that those of us in our earthly life has so-called pie-shaped vision due to the location of our eyes and our skull, Vicky laughed. Her entire life experience during her near-death experience was spherical vision, and she simply couldn't understand why the rest of us have our everyday normal pie-shaped vision. That's a good one.
That is a good one. And so my next question is, with respect to the religious perspectives and spiritual thought systems that human beings subscribe to, have you come to some conclusions kind of about the nature of reality and the nature of what people call God, divinity, and our spiritual being? Just like, what are your thoughts about the nature of ultimate reality now?
Sure. Yeah, great question. In the last 834 near-death experiencers that were shared with us that we analyzed, we had some detailed survey questions asking them point blank, did you encounter any information about love during your near-death experience? About half, a little over half, said yes. And in the narrative response described the unearthly love beyond anything they could know on earth that would even be possible on earth, complete love, total love, unconditional love, non-judgmental love, as the overwhelmingly consistent expression of love that they learned during their near-death experience. And I would submit that's certainly not the kind of consistent impression about love that you'd get if you talk to anybody about their awareness of love in their earthly life. Moreover, a survey question found a very interesting sort of universal concept, and that being a oneness or unity of everyone and everything. That's certainly not classical, certainly Western religious teaching, which is much more likely to emphasize the separation of God from the divine, from humankind. And yet, nearly half of near-death experiencers said yes to the survey question, that they were aware of a oneness or unity. And in fact, in the narrative response to that, they were much more likely to describe what they encountered in their near-death experience as a unity or oneness, as opposed to the weaker word, just simply connection. So vividly, literally by the hundreds, we have near-death experience accounts describing that mystical, unearthly connection, unity, beyond connection, unity, oneness with everyone and everything that, is certainly a surprise to probably essentially all of them. But above and beyond that, nearly half describe encountering or being aware of during their near-death experience of God. Now, I want to emphasize over and over, we have near-death experiencers say things like, God is a human word. What I encountered in my near-death experience, that overwhelmingly loving, awesome, knowledgeable being was far beyond any earthly words or earthly descriptions, that earthly words are limiting, and that this encounter of God that they had was far beyond anything that you could describe appropriately in words. So there does seem to be that universal being, that thing that we're all a part of, as part of that mystical connection, characterized, most commonly described as being overwhelmingly loving, compassionate. They get the sense that God loves them and all of us completely for who we all are, all that we are, everything that we are, unconditionally. And that has certainly been certainly profoundly reassuring to me as I read about that, think about God.
Excellent, and that is a nice offers a nice segue into my next question, which is what you have observed with respect to the transformative, the personally transformative aspect of the near death experience, and just how greatly people's lives are changed by it.
Sure. As you could imagine, after a near death experience, changes in their lives can be dramatic. Now, they may take years to fully manifest. Even positive changes represent letting go of the old and embracing the new. And even after a near-death experience, that could take that journey can literally be years. But both prospective and retrospective studies very consistently describe these changes, called after effects in the scholarly literature. Typically, there's almost none of the people that have a near-death experience fear death anymore. And that's easy to understand. From their perspective, they know what lies beyond death's veil, an afterlife, a wonderful afterlife for them and everybody else. Obviously, there's an increased belief in an afterlife for the same reason. They understand that there is an afterlife because they experienced firsthand and know it. They embrace the love that they so often encounter during near-death experience. They may leave unloving relationships or jobs where they can't manifest values of love. They typically become less materialistic, more interested in spiritual matters. And these are often very profound changes. I mean, people that know people that have a near-death experience that have gone through these change, and they may seem like two different people to them. And they go out, live the rest of their life less afraid, more compassionate, and it certainly seems to help them in many, many ways live the rest of their life more powerfully, more open, and more satisfactorily.
Excellent. And so another question I'd like to ask is, the near death experiences offers, the hope or the affirmation of what you would call like real immortality. But then there's also the philosophical question of how much of oneself actually continues on. And there are even many spiritual thought systems which say that the sense of like a separate individual self is really not valid. And so I'm sure you've gained insights into that as well. So what are your thoughts on that? In what sense should we view ourselves as, quote, immortal? Are we immortal individuals, or are we immortal as something that we can't really relate to in our normal kind of individuated human existence?
Sure. So, from near-death experiences, what is it that survives bodily death? What goes on seeming for eternity? Well, The best evidence is from the life reviews that occur during near-death experience. They can become aware of part or even all of their prior life. I mean, they know who they are, what they are, everything they did. And some of these life reviews, remarkably, also involve awareness of what other people were thinking and doing at the time they interacted with them. And again, remarkably, that can be a very, very deep part of a very, very detailed near-death experience. So certainly all the lines of evidence from near-death experience that suggest who we are, all that we are, all our consciousness memories, what we are goes on. We are what we are in the afterlife, but far more aware, far more enveloped in that loving, beautiful area of the afterlife. And yet we also have that connection with everything and everyone in the afterlife as well. So it's, I guess you could say, the best possible outcome imaginable. We retain that sense of self, and yet we become much more than ourselves. Consciousness greatly accelerated in a remarkably loving environment, and all evidence of near-death experience points that that is indeed eternal.
Excellent. So I think in conclusion, I would just like to give you the opportunity to kind of speak to fellow scientists and say how you would like to envision the scientific investigation into this topic unfolding.
Sure. From a scientific point of view, even after studying near-death experiences and 4,000 of them for over 20 years, I firmly believe that what we don't know about near-death experience exceeds what we do know. We're all still pioneers, those of us that research near-death experiences, and I think there's more and exciting things that we can learn from near-death experiences. I mean, how can you not be fascinated about that key human question, what happens after we die? And here are some of the most powerful evidence that exists on the earth today in near-death experiences. So I would encourage research of all type. Ideally, prospective studies. They're difficult, but I certainly hope that we can have scientists band together and do more of those very important prospective studies. And yet we can learn so much from retrospective studies. We can continue to learn, what occurs during their near-death experiences, how consciousness functions. Near-death experience research answers some of humankind's greatest questions. That is, what happens after we die? Is there an afterlife? The answer seems to be yes. It also informs scientific investigation of consciousness. I mean, here you are with near-death experiencers with tremendously accelerated consciousness during their near-death experience, far outside of anything that would be humanly possible. And it really makes you wonder, what is it that this consciousness that survives? It's accelerated. So again, lots of questions, lots of exciting things that we can all learn. Pretty much any way you research near-death experience with the best scientific methods is going to be a good idea and fruitful for humankind to learn more about these remarkable phenomena.